One of the things that really made an impression on me is when the doctor gave the example of the pastor from Bethany who invited actual scientists into his study and listened to them and actually changed his mind. That shows the required humility that we all need to have, and the respect for one another in the body of Christ, the hand having need of the eye. And I thought that was just a wonderful expression. And his idea behind not only his book, but his ministry is to make those connections happen, right? Because I think that's where change can happen. It happened for me when I came onto your one of the pages you're a moderator on, Answers to Answers in Genesis. And for the first month or two, I didn't say anything. I just listened. And you have biologists and geologists, and they're all most of them are fellow Christians, and they share a passion about Christ and about science. And just to listen to their viewpoints on what was going on in that room was precious to me. So I think that's what I took from the interview that was really important. And I think it's a great approach, because actually sitting down with scientists and finding out that they're just as passionate about Jesus as maybe your young earth creationist youth pastor is, then you don't buy into this dichotomous thinking that it's either God or science. And I think that was really helpful for me. What did you think?
Well, I think one of the things I've come to realize more and more is how important relationships are in changing minds. Most people don't hold their position because they've been argued into it. Most people have a number of reasons for where they are and what they believe. And I think the best way to reach people for Jesus, or to understand about science, or to understand about really anything, to win them to your idea, is through relationship, right? And it has to be a genuine give and take, learn and share, and trying to understand a person who has expertise. Why do you conclude that? What's your basis for that? And I think he really emphasized that, the importance of relationships. His book has a chapter that talks about mentoring, which I think would be really helpful for a lot of young people, and even for a lot of young pastors, to do some kind of mentoring with a scientist, or really experts in their church in every field, just to learn and grow. So let's start with an icebreaker. What would you look for if you were church shopping and wanted to find a healthy church?
I think that, of course, the key thing about any church is that it's Christ-centered, and that it brings us to the knowledge of Jesus. That's the best news the church has, for sure. And, it's interesting in this time of COVID-19, I haven't been attending church in person. I've been with my wife doing virtual worship. So I haven't been involved in a community of faith, like in a real sense. It's been a virtual sense. But I think about some of the things I would love to see when we get back, if I were church shopping. I think in addition to being Christ-centered and centered on the gospel, I would also be really interested in if they had good music. As you can see, I have musical instruments behind me. I love music. I love the way it brings and lifts our spirits to God. But I think the secret sauce for me is the church outward facing? Is there a sense that it exists not for the members within it, but it exists for the city, for the community around it? And I think those things come in very subtle ways. I remember Tim Keller once preaching about this and saying, the way that you talk about the outsider, say in sermons or in announcements, tells a lot about whether you think outsiders, as it were, people who aren't in the community, will be there or not. And so I'd look for a church that welcomes people who are on the fringes, because I've been there looking from, as it used to be, the back of the pews in, and I want people to be welcomed who are in the place I was in when I was a young adult.
Okay, I'm taking notes.
Well, normally I don't step in on an icebreaker, but I have to now, because it was a fascinating answer that you gave, and your answer about considering the outsider in the shape of the church you're looking for is interesting. Recently, the YouTube celebrity Rhett McLaughlin revisited his 1-year deconstruction testimony. And about 50 minutes into this hour-and-a-half episode, he concluded that he was grateful he had left the evangelical world prior to 2020, because he said 2020 revealed some ugly things about the evangelical church. And one of them was, he said he felt like looking at the 2020 white evangelical, that their spokesman was not Jesus Christ, but the My Pillow guy. So
oh my gosh. Wow.
my question to you on that, if that's an outsider looking in, how did, and this might be an unfair question for you, but how do we sidestep or listen to that kind of criticism, take its weight and adjust? If the world is looking at the body of Christ or the bride of Christ and saying, you look fat in that dress, what are the next steps?
In other words, how much should we listen to people who are on the outside? Is that right, John?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I've taken a lot of time to listen to the people on the outside, so it's a very personal question for me. I've done interviews with my students at Chico State University, where I teach, who, it's a secular university, so there's no kind of Christian commitment that's required or part of it. And it's been really fascinating to find out what students think about the church, and what they find interesting about it and what they find problematic about it. And I think it's really helpful to be pondering and taking in those outside voices. As I mentioned earlier, I became a Christian at age 18, and I was looking into the church, as it were, looking into the gospel from the outside. And I've always just got that in my heart. Like, what is that going to be? And are there unnecessary barriers we're putting up for people who just need to hear about Jesus? I said it earlier, but it's very significant to me that the best news the church has is Jesus Christ. That is the best news we have. And so I think we want to keep asking, what is it that we're putting in the way of Jesus? And sometimes we have sort of the Jesus or what C.S. Lewis called in the Screwtape Letters, Christianity and. How much in addition to the center of our faith do we put into our proclamation? Another small point, and we could go more deeply into this, is how much do we use insider language? Language that just doesn't make sense to people who are outsiders. I mean, honestly, having worked as a pastor, served as a pastor for 18 years, I'm not even sure insider language even works for most church people most of the time. So how can we make sure that we're always translating our proclamation, our communication in ways that connect with the outsider? That would be a couple of things I look at. And partly it's the reason that we see, for this is we see, 35 to 40% of 18 to 30-year-olds no longer affiliating or never affiliating with any religious community, primarily, of course, Christian community. And we have to be entirely conscious of how are we inviting people in or disinviting them with the way that we act. So I think it's really important to listen to the outsider.
The statistic you just gave is stark, and it seems to be a phenomenon that is unprecedented. In other words, we have seen that age group wander away from the church and yet come back after married with children. They're not coming back now. What do you have an opinion as to why that is, Doctor, and what can the church do about it?
Well, I think there's two things that I would respond to. And there's obviously people are very concerned about this. I would say to any church leader, we should be concerned about this every day as we lead our congregations. This is the reality we're living in, which may not be all bad. I think we could talk about that too. The two things that I would say is, as the church has often thought of itself, you're either okay if you're in a family or with a family, right? You're good until confirmation or end of high school or something, and then you're good when you come back, as it were, quote, come back with your spouse and children. That period of time has extended. People are getting married later and having children later. That's just the fact of our culture. And so the period in which people aren't going out to church, if that's the way we look at it, is much, much longer. And the longer you don't do something, the more unlikely you are to come back to it. You know what I mean? So it's just habituation, right? And then particularly to the issues of faith and science, when the Barna Group did its look at people who had gone out the back doors of the church and never come back, or just never went into the doors of the church, the book You Lost Me, they found that there were 6 main reasons that people weren't no longer involved in a Christian community. One was the church, in their eyes, saw that it had all the answers. It's not a place for inquiry, which certainly some of the questions that come today come from science and technology. And more specifically, this is the language that always, I guess, shocks me into action, is that the church is seen as, quote, anti-science, end of quote. So I think that it's really important for the church to engage questions. And I think it's important, which is, the center of the book we're going to be talking about, for the church to understand the issues of science and to see the way that science can enhance faith. I think that's significant for this demographic.
Yeah, I would completely agree with that. I hear that perspective from my kids who have felt pressure in our church from youth leaders and even from the pulpit to not accept science. And they both are very interested in scientific fields. One is going into the medical field and the other anyway, it's a really hard position to put students in, and even their parents, to juggle. How do you go to this Christ-focused church if the choice is you have to choose between what's so clearly explained and understandable through science or faith, which maybe is a little more nebulous? Mm-hmm. And that's kind of the focus of a lot of your research, right? Why don't you go ahead and tell us a little bit about your background, both your family background and your academic background and your spiritual journey?
Thank you. Yes. Yeah. Well, and I do think that dilemma is such a part of being a parent. My 2 daughters are in their 20s as well. So, Kristine, I definitely understand what you're saying, or at least I feel like there's a resonance there, at least, right? So I grew up in what we would call today a family of nuns, not the kind that are NUNSs, but the kind NONESs, not religiously affiliating, none of the above when you check the box of what religion are you. I grew up in the Bay Area, and then this should sound a bit like a joke. I went to Berkeley and became a Christian. So at age 17, I went to UC Berkeley, and because I was encountering various people and my own freedom to explore ideas, I was exploring whether the idea of there being no God was really what I wanted to hold to. And I read Mere Christianity, or I had read Mere Christianity, and again, talked with friends that were influential, and became a Christian in my first year at Cal. So that, put me on this path of being in a world-class university where I think often unbelief among my peers who were really smart and my professors who were also really smart were challenging my faith. And I probably would want to throw in there that I was also living in a fraternity. So not only were there intellectual challenges, there were some level of ethical challenges as well. And that was the crucible in which what was presented to me intellectually often was that science and the the growth of science, probably a better way to say it, had invalidated Christianity as a viable alternative. And so the reason that C.S. Lewis, for example, was so influential for my life and hangs above my, my left shoulder, there we go, that's left, is that he engaged with the cultural issues of the day. And for me, that one of those was the worldview that comes from science. So after Cal, just to fast track my life, I got married. Laura and I opened a business in retail, and then I perceived the Holy Spirit calling me in to study to be a pastor, so I did a Master of Divinity degree at Princeton, and then I came back to Berkeley. Laura did a degree in San Francisco. I did a PhD basically in theology and science. And when I started my pastoral work in New York City, I brought that kind of interest in bringing together faith and science to my pastoral work. I was an associate doing adult discipleship, young adult outreach, and that sort of thing. So then I came to Chico, which is in Northern California, north of Sacramento. And here is a university town, right, nestled with the Sierras essentially to the east and to the west. We have beautiful almond fields and rice fields. And it's this town of 100,000 people where there's a lot of university students. And so some of the questions that university students bring continue to be interesting to me. And about that time, I started doing some research, some grant-funded research that got me directly into this ministry of bringing together faith and science for Christian congregations. And then there's a particular project I did that was funded by the John Templeton Foundation, Science and Theology for Emerging Adult Ministries, which looked at how to change and move into emerging adult ministries with science-informed resources. What will it mean? What does it have to offer? I had just finished another project where we interviewed 630 or so, or I think 640 emerging adults in Menlo Park, California, in Chico, and in New York City on the question of what affected your views of faith and science. What are they, and what will bring them to change? And so doing that work and then doing some interviews, some intensive 1-hour interviews with 45 college students and emerging adults over the years, I began to find some patterns that also correlated with other major researchers like Elaine Howard Eklund and Christian Smith and others on what is it that emerging adults believe about faith, and how do faith and science come together or not for them. So all in all, it's this biography of being on the outside, coming into the faith, seeing the compelling nature of faith when it's brought together with contemporary issues, and trying to live that out in the ministries I've been a part of, both as a pastor and now as an academic, and also as a co-director of science for the church.
I want to jump in here and ask you something a little bit pointed in that way, Pastor. And at least in North America, Dr. Joel Duff recently put up some research that he had done on the social media reach of varying Christian organizations that have to do with science. And the big 800-pound gorilla in the room is Ken Ham and Answers in Genesis and the Young Earth creationist organizations. And second to that come in some of the Old Earth creationist and ID groups. But they swamp, at least in numbers, a group like, say, BioLogos that you've written for, that you're familiar with. And so just this morning, I follow Elizabeth Elliot Quotes on Facebook, and I rarely see her post anything about this issue, but she posted how the earth is only 6,000 years old because God tells us that. And it created a little stir on her page. But so my question to you is that, at least in North America, I know it's different around the world, at least in North America, with that kind of a grip on the church, is your mission mostly to those outside the church, or what role do you play within the church to try and undo some of maybe the collateral damage that's going on in this conversation that we're having? Mm-hmm.
Well, my role has been to engage mainstream science with mere Christianity, and so I have to realize where where the settings that God puts me. That didn't come out very clearly. Where has God put me that I can have an influence? And I simply don't come from the Young Earth creationist group, or even from Old Earth creationism. So my effectiveness with that group is pretty low. And so I really have not done a lot with that. My main thing, though, probably to step back, is to say, how is it that we can take science and engage it with Christian faith? And I've been really influenced by a variety of experiences, and some of the writings of people like Jonathan Haidt, who's the social psychologist, who indicate that you don't make change. The change that comes most definitively is through relationships. So Jonathan Hill is another writer, a sociologist at Calvin College, who's influenced me as well. And so I find that the places where I have been in relationships, or where I can resource relationships between scientists and church members, are the ones that will have the highest level of impact. I do want to get back. I'm going to make sure I answer your question directly, John. I think there is a problem with the association of Christian faith with bad science. And Augustine saw it years ago, and he said it basically, I'll paraphrase him, if people hear us talking about things they know about and hear us preaching the gospel, and the things they know about are wrong, they're going to think the gospel is wrong and erroneous too. And there are a number of tragic stories of students that go to college. They hear about the age of the earth, for example, and they hear about, in light of what they've been taught, and they completely have a crisis of faith. I mean, it can be terrible. It can be, I've heard stories of, suicide, depression, et cetera. So I don't want that to happen to the people that I come in contact with. And I think there is a place for engaging, people who do not bring sustained science to faith. With that in mind, what we've really tried to do, and what I found the most effective, is not to start always with the hot button issues if we want to see an engagement of faith and science. To start with these relationships. What does Randy, who is also an evolutionary biologist, what is interesting to him? Let's have him talk about evolution, for example, instead of having Richard Dawkins talk about it, or Jerry Coyne. We know Randy was a youth group leader, or is a youth group leader. We know he is committed to his faith. Let's see how we can learn more, because in every church there's going to be people who are, influenced by answers in Genesis, or maybe resistant. And most scientists are not resistant to mainstream science. So if we talk to them, we get relationships going, we'll find something powerful and changing about that. That would be the way I would go about it. I will just say one more thing that I found really disturbing. In the more recent Barna Group survey called Gen Z, I think they call it, not iGen, same generation, they found that 49% of kids that go to youth group believe basically their church teaches them bad science. And I think there's just a discount factor about reliability when you learn that, when you learn bad things about other stuff that preachers or teachers are giving you in the church. We need to do better work than that, and to understand why and how those the good science can be brought together with good, robust, orthodox faith.
It's an excellent point. I know our family has sat in services where there's been bad science from the pulpit, and right away my kids are like, "Oh, that's not right." And it makes it really hard to be trustful of the rest of the message. It's concerning. I've heard pastors at my church misrepresent, say the theory of evolution, and say that it's, people used to be parrots and before that carrots, or something like that. And, it's catchy and that's what you remember, but that isn't how it works. And, even if that's not your view, I think you ought to represent it accurately. And that's a problem.
Right.
There has been such a fear of talking about these subjects because there's a diverse range of views within churches too. You won't want to talk about that because some people will get upset, and that's really hard.
Yeah, I think that's right. And And I would just go back to what you were saying earlier, John, that I think the messaging of young earth creation is very easy to, there's an advantage that comes from that, right? I mean, one of the problems, say, with evolutionary history is it's really hard for us to conceive of something that goes on as long as the earth, as long as the universe, and therefore as long as it takes to have evolution happen. I mean, of course, that was one of the things that held up Darwin's theory from being accepted early on, was people like Calvin didn't think the earth was old enough for all the evolution to occur. And so anyway, we have a difficulty with it. It's much easier to message a young earth creationist message. And I think we're going to get into intelligent design, the specific paradigm of intelligent design that has an ease about its naming, which is really makes it just more attractive. And one of the things I've discovered about emerging adults, and about many of them now through my college teaching, is social media is really powerful. And what can be put into a meme, what can be reduced to a TikTok video, is going to just be much more easy to sell. So I don't want to sound, at all overly optimistic. I just do believe that this is true. Like, scientists studying the universe, studying the creation, studying nature are going to find what ultimately is true about it, and that will be revelatory and in a way of the God who created and how God created. So if we bring those true things to our faith will be stronger. And here's the payoff for me. When we did this large grant called Scientists and Congregations, where we paired a scientist with a pastor in 37 congregations, worked with them for 3 years, gave some grant money and so on. One of the things that was interesting when we went back and saw did it work was that these congregations definitely grew in their understanding of science. They definitely grew in their understanding of science and how it related to their faith. But most interesting was they grew in how they saw their faith generally, like bringing their faith to truth, the truth of the world in whatever form it was, revealed. This would be the natural scientific or natural, the truth of nature. To engage with that was actually good for their faith. They grew in their faith. And at the end of the day, that is what I'm motivated by, is can we have a robust faith? Can we have a robust faith that comes to the way God has created this world, but, just to the truth of God's world in all the ways that it exists?
Let me ask you, Greg, about the title of your book, because it is a little bit of a play on Lewis, right? Hold on, Kristine. You like to show off. You have the hard copy, and I'm the Kindle guy, so I'm going to let you. There we go. Okay, that looks great. Mere Science and Christian Faith. So what I want to ask you about that, Doctor, is how you came upon that title. What did you mean it to communicate? The mirror is rather famous in Lewisian circles. Maybe you could just tell us how you came to that and what you mean to communicate in the book.
Thank you. Yeah, it's one of the titles we threw around was that phrase I threw out a little bit earlier, mere Christianity and mainstream science. And I'll just be honest, I'm not the best titler in the world. So I hope I'm a good writer, but my editors have been better titlers. One of the books that I wrote was called, it was about limiting your life and the importance of saying no. And my editor came up with say yes to no, which is like this brilliant saying, I just couldn't do it. So when I worked with InterVarsity, InterVarsity really works as a team. I should say that when I say they really worked to come up with something that would talk about this particular concern. How do we bring the consensus of science to Orthodox Christianity? So the mere science, yes, was a play on Lewis. Lewis makes his way into almost every book I've written. And my intent was to say, let's look at science as it is, mere science. Okay, so again, evolution, which is such a flashpoint for people, but it could be neuroscience, it could be genetics. How do you look at the science itself? Again, in evolution, not what Richard Dawkins uses it to mean, not what Jerry Coyne uses evolution to do, but what is biology? What is physics? What are these? What do they reveal? That's the mere science part of it. Like, let's get right to the science. And then how does that relate? I also teach in a multi-religious context in a secular university. And I think the Christian faith brings particulars to this conversation that are really, really important and super incredibly exciting. So I wanted to make sure that I was clear about this. I'm not talking about a generic lowest common denominator religion. I'm talking about Christian faith. I'm talking about the faith that helps us when we have trouble in our marriages, the faith that helps us when we feel we need to pray, the faith that helps us to be able to love our neighbor. That's the faith that I wanted to connect with science. So the intent of the title was to do that kind of communication. And of course, to give homage to Lewis, because he really is such a mentor to me and to so many people who have done this work.
Now, my daughter really likes C.S. Lewis. She's read several of his books. So in your book, though, you have 4 methods for dealing with science and faith, and they're warfare, independence, dialogue, and integration. Tell us a little bit about each of these 4 methods and what you would recommend.
Yes, and if you don't mind, Kristine, I'll compress them to 3. I'll put the last 2 together because they're kind of close in terms of like collaboration. That'll shorten the answer a little bit. But yeah, this is a way that Ian Barber, a physicist, theologian in the 60s, put out a typology for understanding how science and faith come together. And one is conflict. And, we know lots of voices like that. You've mentioned Ken Ham. I was going to make a detour to say Philip Johnson, who was a friend, but also a leader of the ID movement, which I see as, well, Johnson's very clear. He was very clear. He was out to move against, evolutionary science. He felt that it was atheistic. There's that side. There's both sides in conflict. And what's fascinating is this was a polemic, an argument that was presented in the late 19th century with great power by Andrew Dixon White as one of these voices who started Cornell College, the first fully secular college. And this conflict thesis is still prominent with people today. It is probably the least prominent of those opinions, but it has a lot of traction. So if you were to ask people a kind of objective question, out there in the world, do the teachings of science and religion ultimately conflict? Especially emerging adults, because that's been my focus. About 68% of emerging adults will say, yes, the teachings of science and religion ultimately conflict. Now, what's interesting is then another study, parallel study to the one I just mentioned, the first one had 2,400 people, and the second one had 10,000. It's a study of spirituality run through UCLA. They asked students to complete this sentence. For me, the best relationship between science is, and that first two word phrase is key. For me, the best relationship is conflict, collaboration, or independence. And most people will pick collaboration or independence. So independence says these are 2 parallel tracks. Science tells us the what, religion tells us the why. As Galileo was said to have quipped, science tells us how the heavens go, not how to go to heaven. So, it's an easy way to put these 2 together. And I will say that I think Philip Johnson was onto something when he said the problem with that is it's kind of like separate but equal was in the Jim Crow South. It's always separate but unequal. So as long as you keep that perspective and religion withers away, gets just a very individual me and Jesus or me and my God sorts of thing, me and my spirituality, that's fine. Science can have the culture. And that's the problem with the independence model. I would also mention the great paleontologist Stephen Jay Gould, who presented that in his own words with NOMA, non-overlapping magisterial authority. At any rate, that's the independence model. Slightly more people than the conflict model. So something like, I think it's like 31%, 34%, and that would leave me with 35%, I believe, somewhere around there. I actually believe that something like collaboration is the best. And collaboration is the idea that these 2 work together, that our lives cannot be separated. And I think Francis Collins, who's just somewhere below C.S. Lewis, but not too far below, because he's one of my heroes today, would indicate as a leading scientist and a outspoken Christian and the founder of BioLogos, that he would say, well, we got to respect that these are different. The science and faith, Christian and faith are not the same thing, but we also have to see how can they work together in the right way. And we can get into that, but I would simply say that, how we understand the human being, how we understand our ethical actions, these are places where the two need to come together at some level. And a lot of people want to see that happen. When I talk to my students in an anecdotal kind of way, I'll just say that they would like to see this come together. They want to see this, even if they're not people of Christian faith or even very committed faith. They want to see religion and science collaborate.
Well, let's talk about that for a second, because I mean, on the ground or on the street, you might say, they haven't really danced well for 500 years. I mean, prior to Galileo, right? You can make that argument. I'm not saying that dogmatically, right. But and then when you see in modern times how people have tried to force those two dogs into the same pen, they usually end up, with fur flying. And so you have part of the Christian faith trying to read science into Genesis and in kind of a concordist way, trying to make the Bible align with modern science or the Bible trump modern science. And so when you see it done wrong, Doctor, what would be the recipe to do it right? I mean, we've seen so many people try to bring these two together, and it doesn't turn out well. I can almost see the rationale for Gould's argument because they just don't seem to play together well. Yes.
Well, it's tricky. It's tricky. I remember J.B. Phillips, who translated the Bible into modern language back in the day of the mid 20th century. He said, translating the Bible was like working with the electricity in the house on, working on the electricity of the house with the power on, right? And I think that's what it feels like to engage with faith and science. And yes, sometimes it's done really badly. So I'm thinking about it primarily from the church leadership perspective. That's how I'm going to answer it, but please take me a different direction if that's not how, there's another way to think it, we want to, plumb the depths of. I think that a lot of the problems of faith and science really are biblical interpretation. And so we can, and worldview. So I think pastors need to have a nuanced biblical interpretation. And I people like John Walton have been really great with that, who've indicated that the Bible isn't really teaching about, scientific truth. I think you alluded to that in your question, that what it's teaching about is how God created this world as a home for us and has a relationship with us and wants to have a relationship with us and has put His image in us. Those are things that the text is teaching. So partly it's, working not just with science, but with good biblical interpretation. I would, with the view of the human being and worldview, I would say, this is a place we can talk about things as pastors and engage with a scientific worldview that's sometimes presented as science, but isn't really science. So Dawkins seems to be coming up in my mind today. And one of the things he writes, I think it's in River Out of Eden, which of course is a biblical image. He says that the universe we see is at the bottom, blind, pitiless indifference. That's how he sees DNA functioning. It's blind, pitiless indifference guiding all of life. Now, as a Christian, we can just say that kind of worldview is not a Christian worldview. We can fully discuss that and say, well, we can engage the worldview. So that would be a good way, I think, of bringing scientific views or putatively scientific views to faith. And then we can put out, well, here's what Francis Collins says, I find that studying the universe is a way to understand the majesty of God. Or Jeff Hardin in Madison, Wisconsin, who's a biologist, I believe is his title. He was at biology, has biology departments, about how science is worship, right? I mean, these things help, I think, on the level of worldview of a way of engaging our faith with our science. The final thing I would say, and this is the scary part. Again, as a church leader, pastors don't like to be wrong. They don't like, they're often control freaks. I'm within the guild, so I'm speaking a little more critically, right? Often pastors want to control everything. And there's a humility that comes when we engage with scientists in our congregations. And we say, tell me about evolution. Tell me about what your discoveries of neuroscience show, and help me to be knowledgeable enough to do this right, to not do it badly, but to do it right. Every book I've written, when I've not been trained in the relevant sciences, and I'm primarily not trained as a scientist, I have relied on a team of scientists that I know to help me get my facts right, and had to read through it and make sure I am not making mistakes. So that's the same thing I would take into pulpits and to take into the proclamation of the gospel in light of science, is to say, let's make sure we have a person we're in a relationship with who's a scientist who can help me do this right and help me to engage this in a way that's accurate.
I would love to see that. I would love to see if a pastor is preaching on a particular passage that does intersect with science or history, that they make use of resources to be sure they're presenting it right. And if they don't know, maybe even present a couple possible options. Right. But I think that's, in my experience anyway, has been pretty rare. For example,
can I just give
yeah. Sure.
Oh, there's one example I was going to give was I've been told that Richard Dahlstrom up at Bethany, up from me in Seattle area at Bethany Community Church, had been hearing about a evolutionary creationist perspective, and he brought together, I think it was 4 or 5 scientists in his office. This is a large evangelical church, and said, "Tell me about what you believe, or not. What your science leads you to conclude." And he listened. He realized he wasn't a scientist. He realized there was a compelling case for evolution, and he changed his approach. I mean, that's what pastors should do, right? They should look clearly at faithful, trustworthy people in various fields. It could be business, it could be the arts, and get their facts straight, you might say, but just learn what else they can gain from somebody outside of their field of expertise. And I thought that was a beautiful image of humility, and what I hope more pastors will do.
That would be great. So when you do start talking about human evolution, we have all these questions now about the soul or the image of God. How does that all work? If humans evolved from a population and there were never less than 10,000 members of that population, how do we view the image of God, or what is the soul? And how do we stay faithful to our understanding from Scripture in light of the information we've learned from biology?
Yes. I think that's where the flashpoint comes for a lot of people with evolution, especially this question of the historical Adam. And I'm not going to veer away from what you're asking me, but that's where we say, how do we get the image of God in us? And I was thinking about this a little bit today as in preparation for our conversation. And I realized that there was this ongoing question of where does the soul come from way before evolutionary history, was brought forward as a scientific paradigm. You think about it, does it come at the point of conception? Because that would mean then, is it like half the mother, half the father, and then at conception, they bring the soul, those two halves become the soul. So this question about the soul has been around for a long time. And I suppose I would put it into the category of this is something that God does for us. He creates all human beings in his image, which means we bear the marks of relationship, relationality, the ability to relate to on 4 axes, you might say, or 4 aspects. 1, our vertical relationship with God. 2, our relationship with other human beings. 3, the relationship with the creation and the earth. And 4, our relationship with ourselves, which is implied. Those come from having the image of God in us. And you asked about the soul, but I put the image of God very close to what the soul means. I think our particular human soul reflects the fact that God has created his image in us. Now, does that come, back to this question that was in traducianism, right? This idea of did the mother and father bring each half of the soul that was brought into, the moment of conception? I am not sure. I just know that God is behind it, and whether that happens with every person that's born, whether that has happened through time, so that in some way through evolutionary time we are able to manifest this ability to have relationality. I'm not sure, but I know that God is behind it. I think what we can say is we can see how it is effective, how it being the soul and the image of God are effective in human beings. I don't quite know how it happens. Again, if it happens through time, I don't see that as actually any less problematic than happening with the first Adam. Like, how did Adam then and Eve pass on the soul if that was the first soul-bearing human being? It's a question that I keep leaning on, evolutionary biologists, anthropologists, neuroscientists, et cetera, to give me answers to. I would just say one last part about this, because this is often where the soul comes in. What happens then after we die? What is it that continues? And part of what we learn from science, which is reaffirming the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, is that we are psychosomatically unified. We are body and soul together. We are a unified being. So when we die and are resurrected, the resurrection of the body is the whole idea that all of us are something that is like our physical nature, probably in a new heaven and a new earth world, will be connected to our non-physical part, and we will be reconstituted, because that's the promise of what it is to be created. So I believe our soul is that relationship with God, that God sustains even when our body dies, and then at the resurrection we are remade as new beings in the new heaven and the new earth.
I think that's where it goes back to the very simple young earth creation view that's so almost trivial. As is with most things in life, reality is complex and nuanced, and there just aren't really simple, easy answers for very many things at all in reality. So I thought that was phrased nicely and gives us a way to think about it. And I also think, that would lead into perhaps an understanding of our sin nature or original sin. If there weren't, say, an original single couple, Adam and Eve, who were the first people and the progenitors of all people, I've heard some say, well, then why do we need Jesus if there's not original sin? And I think, okay, do you not do any self-reflection? Do you not do any introspection? Don't you know that you need a savior? Tell us more what you think about original sin in the context of, if there's not a literal Adam and Eve, but it's something different. What do you think about that?
Yes. And I would say that I think there are some good models in which you can have an original pair that is, to use John Collins's language, the headship of humanity. My friend and colleague Gary Fugel would use the same image, that somehow there would be this first pair that really, Adam and Eve would be guiding the evolutionary history. Their decisions would, in some ways, then map out into the 6 to 10,000 people. There are models that work that way. I tend to be convinced more by what C.S. Lewis was convinced by, that, the understanding we see from the Genesis text is God creating us to have self-reflection. This is that one of these relationality elements, right? That we can relate to ourselves. Like, as far as I can tell, my cat, whom I love, does not think about the fact that he is thinking, right? He doesn't think, oh, should I have water now, or should I have, whatever, kibble, or that's not cat food, but cat food, right? It's like, he just does it. He doesn't reflect. He doesn't think about, am I eating too much? He just eats. And the fact that we do is the element that gives us the ability, I think, to sin. Also, it gives us the ability to transcend and to relate to God, but it also gives us the ability to sin. So if you read the Genesis text in that way, and the way Lewis did, he would say at some point, and then John Polkinghorne would be another person, the physicist theologian, that at some point in the history of the development of Homo sapiens, we had this ability to reflect on ourselves And the ability to reflect allows us to worship. That's the difference we have from other animals. It also gives us the ability to sin, because we can imagine counter scenarios. I mean, like one of the most basic sins, to lie, is the ability to say, instead of telling you what is true, I'm going to tell you something that will deceive you for my advantage, right? That takes a certain level of consciousness, and what I would say is related to the image of God. I mean, that's the crazy part of this. So the way I would understand it is, as evolutionary history progressed, and at some point, which seems to be the emergence of modern human culture, we had the ability to reflect, and that reflection allowed us to sin. So when I wrote a book, my first book I wrote, I think was 20 years ago for my denomination, and it's called Creation and Last Things. It was about how science and faith come together. And I struggled with this particular question, where are we in evolutionary history? Where are we in terms of sin? And I recognize that the center of my faith is Jesus Christ. The center of the Christian faith is Jesus Christ. What, in a way, do we need for Jesus' redemption to be true, to be necessary, to be effective? Well, we need to know that we're sinful. So Adam is not, like a historical Adam is not necessary for that. What is necessary is to realize that what we see in Adam, which of course means man or human, is the kind of turning away from God that we all do. And we, because of that, need the God-man, God in human form, in Jesus, to save us from that. I honestly don't see a problem. I mean, as a theologian, which is really my most deep training, I don't see any way that not having a historical Adam invalidates the need for the historic God-man and Redeemer Jesus Christ to save us. I think they create exactly the same problem for which God has given us exactly the same solution.
Yeah, I mean, I can just say from personal experience, that ability to lie comes young. I'm thinking with my kids, they were just barely able to talk before they could choose to lie. And we all bear it. If we do any sort of self-reflection, I don't even think you need to self-reflect. I think it's just so clear to us that we are sinful, and and we need a savior.
As the stand-in for the atheists who are listening to our show, I'm going to ask you both, and it's from a conversation between a thoughtful atheist friend of mine who was breaking bread with a thoughtful Christian friend of mine, and he challenged him by saying, I don't see how my definition of being human differs with your definition of being sinful. So if you were in that conversation, how do you answer that? Because he doesn't need to create a fallen or original sin to understand that humans aren't perfect or fail. And yet Christians develop this doctrine around at least those failings that we call the sin nature or the fall. How do you differentiate what you mean by sin with what the materialist means by being human? Either one of you, and
I will defer. I'm happy to answer, but I've been talking a lot. So, Kristine, do you want to take the first shot at that?
No, I mean, I think that's a good point, right? I think that's the whole, all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. None of us is perfect. That is what it is to be human. Adam and Eve's story is each of our story. That is humanity. And Jesus became human to have relationship with us, to redeem us through his life, death, and the resurrection.
I think that's right. And I would, first, is it okay, John, if I go ahead, or did you want to have a second question?
I do have a second question, but I want you to go ahead and take a swing, and then I'm going to ask you a Lewis question. Yeah.
Nice. Yes. And I'll just quote Lewis, and then it'll be done. It'll sound brilliant if I can remember something. Anyway, back to original sin. I'm happy in any way that secular knowledge would lead to a very similar conclusion to Christianity, even if it's from different starting points. That's just fine for me. I mean, I'm like, if that were true, that's okay. I do think, however, that sin is not just something that human beings have. Sin is also, especially see this in the teachings of Paul, it's something that's cosmic and outside of us. So, sin is, in theological language, is eschatological, apocalyptic. It's something that God has to also overcome by the victory of the cross. That's bigger than us. You get a sense of that from many passages, in my opinion, but Romans 7 would be one of them. Like, the sin is working in Paul. He's struggling with it, right? It's not like it's just him making decisions. It's like there's an outside force that is working on him. So I think the Christian view of sin is broader than just individual sin, and therefore more problematic. I mean, I think that's where we can understand things like structural racism. We can understand the principalities and powers. Those are the powers of sin that are greater than an individual and even greater than human beings at some level. I do want to add one other thing, just in case the listeners to this show might think, well, boy, I was with you, Greg, until you said you don't need Adam to, or Adam and Eve. You don't need historical Adam for the Christian faith. I want to be very clear. There are people who have worked out excellently mainstream science paradigms with an historical Adam. I think of Joshua Swamidass. I think of my colleague Gary Fugel, I was just mentioning in his book. And there are others. So I don't want to say, I want to say the way that I read mainstream science, it's not possible. It's more likely for there not to be a historical Adam and Eve. And again, I join with Lewis in that. But there are people who take all the science I take very seriously and come to the conclusion that Adam and Eve could have existed in certain different ways or whatever. But, I wouldn't want that to hold up somebody from seeing the vibrancy of bringing together mainstream science and their faith.
Although it probably will. Unfortunately, it probably will. I mean, because that's how those conversations go. We're still not looking for the actual Pandora, but we need an actual Adam. Coming back to my question on Lewis, and this is something that Kristine and I have been pretty passionate about, and that is, you mentioned that Christian voices or spiritual leaders or pulpits can lead in a certain way if they had this understanding of modern science that it wasn't a threat, and if they adopted the humility that was expressed by the pastor from Bethany that you mentioned, that invited expertise into his office and listened, and yet you said that there's a tendency with pastors not to do that, and you mentioned resources, and of course you've mentioned Francis Collins a number of times and C.S. Lewis, and I want to comment that a little bit here, but carefully, by saying that it seems to me, by looking at the landscape, and to Kristine, that most of the Christian resources kind of break down the way that earlier social media study did, and that is Christians are more likely to take resources from the Discovery Institute than they would possibly from BioLogos and stuff. And when you view the landscape of modern apologetics, it is a rarity to find a pastor like that pastor from Bethany. I know they're out there, and they're more than anecdotal, because I'm one of them. But I do think it's like finding the rainbow unicorn here we make fun of in Phoenix, because the rainbow unicorn is somebody who was born here, and no one was born from here. But so let me ask you this: in light of apologetics and the coming years and where we are right now, Doctor, Lewis spoke of what was really imminent for him was this idea of kind of finding the source of joy. He wasn't alone in that. I think he called it Sehnsucht. If you read Pascal made the same comment. Augustine made the same comment about the God-shaped vacuum, or the hole in the human heart that only God could fill. And it seems that modern apologetics is seeking to answer the Enlightenment with a firm, pat answer. and almost as if maybe the scientism that Lewis warned about, on one end of the spectrum, a materialist scientism, has morphed in our age into kind of a theological scientism. And so my question to you is, how is that overcome, other than just being an example ourselves? How do you overcome that strong of a magnetic pull when you see the landscape? There's really no one out there. We have to defer, other than Francis Collins, and Collins was so shaped by Mere Christianity. He was so shaped by Lewis's example. It's almost as if C.S. Lewis is still the leading apologist of the 21st century, because he spoke to the imagination and not just the reason. I'd just like to get, as somebody who wrote a book on Lewis and has that in mind, here's my question, and I'll make it pointed since you're so involved with science as well. Do we make a mistake by leaving aside the imagination and trying to answer the Enlightenment questions of those who have doubts?
I think the church would make a mistake if it was only taking on the Enlightenment or taking on materialism as a philosophical concept. And I think that's where Lewis was so powerful. But I think what makes Lewis amazing was he did both. And he really did them throughout his life. The shift he made in about 1950 was when he started writing Narnia. Late 40s, he saw his own work with apologetics come somewhat to a close. And if you read his letters, he writes this letter right before Narnia comes out, and he's writing to this kind of confessor he has, who's an Italian priest, Roman Catholic priest, and says, "Father, I think I've lost, whatever." I'm going to paraphrase, whatever kind of mojo I had, whatever writing I had, it's all kind of flat right now. And where do I go from here? And then boom, he writes Narnia, which is his most important work for sure in terms of its effect to this day. You probably know that the most reluctant convert about Lewis's life is coming out. It's being filmed right now. And I think he's still a fascinating figure. So I think I would say that what I found in Lewis is an ability to bring together the rational side, and too often people only read him as the rational side. But you read Mere Christianity, and it's just full of little stories. I love that story in the intro. He says, is Mere Christianity where you want to end? He's like, no, Mere Christianity is a hallway. And he gives you this image. It's a hallway. And in that hallway are many doors. And you're going to have to go through one of those doors to actually find, and I wish I could be as good as him, as something like to find food and a fire and fellowship, right? You're not going to find the door through Mere Christianity. That's the hallway, but that's not the living space. And, we're going to have to land somewhere. We're going to have to be Presbyterian or non-denom or, influenced by Hillsong or by Bach or by Black gospel. Like at the end of the day, we're going to have a language we find our home in. And that's part of being human. I think the only other thing I would say, and I honestly, obviously could go on forever and ever about Lewis, because he's been such a vibrant figure for me, is he recognized that imagination was incredibly important to change. He realized that it was George MacDonald that baptized his imagination after he had turned away from Christ as a teenager, when he got MacDonald's book, and that changed everything for him. And so we could go into some of his writing where he specifically says, like, it's the apologist evening prayer. I do all this great stuff. I have all these victories, but at the end of the day, are the angels crying? I just silenced my enemy, but did I actually gain anybody for what's most important? And I think he saw that the Christian life isn't just about what Joel Green called justification one time in one of my classes with him. He says also signification. It's like, what does it signify? What does it look like to be a Christian? Well, it looks like being a Christian is you always have this world around you, like Narnia, right? At some point, you're going to open that wardrobe, and there's going to be magic world, a new world out there. And that's, I think, how Lewis saw all of our existence. We can't set it up. We can't manipulate it. But at some point, we've got to have a vision for something greater than just this flat earth that we live on. I'm not in terms of flat earth, but like that's all there is. There's no heaven, no hell, nothing, no depth. He realized there's something more powerful. And I think that was what made him an apologist that we still need to listen to. Do we have somebody who's like that today? I have not found that person, but Pascal had a few hundred years before there was another person of his level, I think. So maybe that's just what happens. These shining stars are few and far between.
Yeah, I think you mentioned a lot of my favorite things about Lewis. One of the things he talked about is to get the Christian message beyond the person's watchful dragons. That. Mm-hmm. So they might have a wall up when it comes to in your face rational argument, and yet you can hide these precepts in romantic literature, and it sneaks by their sleeping dragons. I thank you for sharing that about Lewis. When people ask me if I'm a Presbyterian or I'm Calvinist or Arminian, I comment I'm a puddle glum Narnian. and that usually puts their head in a spin, but that's where I'm at right here. Kristine, I know we're running out of time, and I'm going to defer to you now. Do you have anything else you wanted to ask?
Well, it's kind of follow up on that a little bit, because you had started the question talking about the idea of ID and answering the Enlightenment, and in your book you address that you talk with a lot of scientists and biologists about the concept of intelligent design. So let's talk a little bit about the difference between intelligent design as being promoted by the Discovery Institute versus a more traditional understanding of intelligent design that would be, say, something that Dennis Lamoureux would hold to. And then why or why not? What do scientists say? Do they think it's plausible? Do they see that God needs to be involved in tinkering with the biology on the way? Is ID something we should really lean into, or maybe is it a stumbling block for the biologists in our congregation?
Yes. Well, I would just say that, as a specific scientific paradigm, the capitalized intelligent design has just not been sustained within the scientific community. I don't say that, by the way, as somebody who's in the guild of biology, but in just talking with biologists that I trust, they just say, it's just not sustainable. And I'll explain why in just a minute. But that idea of trust is really important to me. So I think there's two aspects to trust. There's trust of character and there's trust of competency. And so when I'll talk again about my friend Gary Fugel, who was a biologist for many years in Chico, where I live, professor of biology. It's, I trust that he knows his stuff. That's the trust and the competency. I trust that he is committed to Christ. That's the character. And I learn from him, and I end up, listening to a lot of those kinds of biologists, and not just creating some kind of vote or consensus, in some sort of numerical way, but saying what makes sense to them. And the intelligent design paradigm, again, as a scientific paradigm, is not sustainable. And intelligent design plays on what I would call small I and D intelligent design, which is what we all believe as Christians, that there is this God, the God we know in Jesus Christ, who's intelligent and who's designed this creation. And I'll get back to that also in a second, because I think that's a key place where Christian views of biology and evolution come into play. But back to ID, those key elements that it seeks to bring and is sought to bring and to prove is, specified complexity and irreducible complexity. And specified complexity is some sense that there is complexity in the way that creation is, and because it's complex and specific kind of complexity, that proves the designer. And then irreducible complexity, I think you were referring to a minute ago, Kristine, about, within, say, the blood clotting, right? Or blood bacterial flagellum, these structures in biology, that they're so complex they couldn't evolve step by step. They have to evolve all at once. That indicates that God did it sort of all at once. I'm simplifying, what has filled many, many pages, but it's the problem of the God of the gaps, which we've looked at over the years, where there's a gap in scientific knowledge and we insert God there. And then the problem is that science keeps working at what are the causal relations within nature. And they say, well, we continue to draw connections. And so those gaps disappear. And here I'll lean on my friend from BioLogos, Jeff Schloss. He says, the idea that the bacterial flagellum is like a mousetrap, it couldn't exist except as mousetrap piece by piece. He said, well, it just kind of falls apart. You know what I mean? Again, we could go into the specifics, but it just, yes, there's a way that evolution can work such that it created these, quote, irreducibly complex structures. I would just say one last part, because I think this is so important for Christians. When we talk about evolution, we can talk about it mechanistically. Like, here are the mechanisms, here are the natural cause and effect relationships within biology that cause an evolutionary process, right? Or that describe an evolutionary process. But the great debate that went on all the way from Asa Gray and Darwin, Asa Gray being a Christian at Harvard, who was Darwin's greatest promoter in the United States, it was at this very point. He said, in all this process, I see a designer, I see a creator. And Darwin said, I can't go there. I'm an agnostic. So we want to separate, I think, the mechanistic or natural processes that are described in evolution from people who say, no, we can still, how should I say this? In dual causation, there's also a God who through that causes things to occur. Back to the image of God. Through the processes, perhaps of evolution, God caused a being who we are to be able to relate to him and bear his image. And then at some point, to him, he became incarnate in that being. So that to me is possible. That intelligent design is possible, but it's not viewable purely from a scientific perspective. And because science should never tell us all of reality. That's not what science is supposed to do. It's supposed to help us with natural cause and effect relationships.
Yeah, I love that idea of dual causality that allows us to see God as providentially behind all of it, not just the parts we don't know, right? We don't have to use God to fill gaps. We can attribute all of it to God and praise him for everything, yes, for the wondrous things that we understand, as well as the pieces we have yet to learn.
Yeah.
So I think that's a beautiful way of looking at it. Yeah.
Yes.
I think that's also I think that's really important for the non-scientist people in our lives too, that they can enjoy a sunset just as much as a scientist who understands the different frequencies of the light and how it's scattered in the atmosphere, and could describe it with the mathematical equation. But both can equally enjoy the beauty, and hopefully both come to a wonder and an awe and a worship of God through what He's made. And I feel like that's lost a little bit when we get stuck on, were Adam and Eve real people, and how long ago was the earth made, and the church gets so stuck in these battles with, and then you lose the whole beauty and wonder and joy and connection to God and with God when you're out in nature, because of this, I don't know, like almost bitter atmosphere in the church about science.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah, you miss the beauty of it. You miss the wonder, like you're saying, and the sense that, say, Copernicus talked about, that to understand the incredible mathematics of the universe just implied that there was a good and gracious creator. Or Charles Towns, the Nobel Prize winner, has talked about the importance of having a creator, for there to be a creation that was ordered with its laws, not just a chaos. I think you're right. I think we miss that sometimes in the polemics. The polemics are problematic, which is another reason, by the way, I think that Lewis moved away from apologetics to imagination, because he recognized at some level you want to give people a vision for what this means, not just defending it. Apologetics is, of course, responses to criticism. So in a way, it's always a defensive mechanism. And I think Lewis helped to see the positive, that we want to present also the vision. And in this case of science, what does it mean to be a Christian who practices science? Jennifer Wiseman, the really leading astronomer in our country, she'll show you the pictures of the stars. She'll show you the complexity. I mean, she has a star named after, for goodness sake. How many people have that kind of knowledge of the universe around us, and then tell you that only gives her greater reason to praise God? I think that's extremely important in this work of faith and science. It's not only an apologetic work, it's also an imaginative work and an evocative work. I think that that is really powerful. As Lewis said, I believe in Christianity as I believe in the sun, not because I can see it, but because I can see everything else by it. Does the Christian vision help us to understand science more powerfully? And I give a resounding yes to that. And we have to help people to see that side of this interaction, the beauty, the awe, and the majesty that scientists who are Christians can tell us about.
Yeah, absolutely. You have a quote in your book: although I'm convinced that science can inform, but not dictate ethics, nevertheless, let's be sure to take in what science can tell us. So I think that this is a really good follow-on to think about where we can use science if we get past the whole conflict thing and we start engaging in a more of a dialogue or an integration, collaboration. I see a really huge need for Christians to become involved in the ethical pieces of science that are really important in our society today, with artificial intelligence and deep machine learning becoming more and more controlling of like Facebook algorithms and advertising, as we have more abilities to edit genes and do cloning. With our world food supply, there is so much need for ethical decisions to be made, and it feels like there's a huge potential for the church to be involved in this activity, but not if we're still stuck way back in past before Darwin and Galileo and still quibbling over these details of creation, and you'll never get Christians involved with these more nuanced topics.
Yep. Yeah. So, and I think we need to be informed by science as Christians, and I think you also inferred in that, which something I completely agree with. We need Christians in these sciences to influence the work of science, right? So, the first thing I'd say is what I was trying to get at there is I think science does not create ethics, but science can inform ethics. And one thing I'm working on right now is what does science tell us about, quote, going to church, end of quote. So in a pandemic where for good, health reasons, we are not meeting together, what will it look like to get back to church? And what are we losing in not meeting in person? And the social science tells us, for example, a really powerful thing that I think Scripture has told us, that it is important to be in the same room, praising God together, sharing side by side in mission. Those are actually that's an ethical thing. In other words, it's good to be together. That would be what I would consider to be an ethical statement. And science can support that. I don't think science can tell us that. I don't think science by itself says, here's what you must do, but it can say, here is support for something that we see as important. Science also tells us to act empathically toward people around us. Actually, is good for us. We actually become, more human, more fully alive as we care for others. There's been some work through the Fetzer Institute that indicates this. Pamela Epstein King at Fuller Seminary has been one of the commentators on this, and just really bringing out how science informs being ethical. Living out the parable of the Good Samaritan, living out the second commandment to love your neighbor as yourself, that's incredibly powerful. But one of the things that, or in addition, that's not a but, and one of the things and reasons that I've wanted to be involved in churches is because churches form how Christians think about science. And one of the reasons Christians are often underrepresented in the sciences is because they've gotten a message that being a scientist isn't that much different from, say, being, I don't know, a pornographer or something like that. Like, it's this weird thing, it's like, it's immoral, and we're trying to just, one of the key things we're working with is Science for the Churches can we see science as legitimate Christian vocation, calling from God? And yes, the answer is yes. And why is it a yes? Because we want people who are Christians to be in science, in the discourse. When you get these very complicated conversations like CRISPR, gene editing, right? You need to know the science really well, or AI. You need to know the science really well. So Christians have to start from a perspective of, this is good to know the science for me to be involved in it. But by giving an anti-science approach, studies have demonstrated that Christians actually think they're not good at science. Like, they've internalized the bias and prejudice, and therefore they're less likely to go into sciences as a calling. So we're trying to change that. And I think that's one of the effects that we want to have in terms of this ethical interface, is to make sure we're getting Christians in to bring the ethics of Christianity into how the sciences are used.
Well, I mean, that's just fantastic and so needed. So if there's any pastors watching, or youth leaders, or regular people, what do you recommend quick for some resources to learn more? Different organizations or resources for the church or for themselves to
a book
come
called
up to
Mere
speed.
Science and the
Yes,
Christian.
in addition to this fantastic
Let's
book.
start there. Yeah.
I mean, there are some tips that I give in there. I'll just say one that's been really significant for me is to have people who endorse that this is an important conversation. So I think a pastor who says, you need to engage with science, that is just a huge step. Like, to be in the sciences, like I just talked about, that is a really important endorsement. And I recognize the limits of pastoral authority, having been a pastor, but I also recognize that pastors still have a say in people's lives that can be helpful. Of course, BioLogos, I'm an advisor at BioLogos. So I'm in full support of the work they do. They do incredible resourcing. Science for the Church has a resource page and a newsletter that we put out weekly. So it's just scienceforthechurch.org. You can look up resources on different topics. I mean, there are definitely other organizations that come to mind. ASA is one, American Scientific Affiliation. Dozer, Dialogue on Science, Ethics, and Religion, which is more of a multi-religious organization through the American Association for the Advancement of Science. It has some great resources as well. I do think we're lacking a bit, though. I mean, I think we need to have more people who are giving us resources for pastors. The best resource for any pastor, for any church leader, is to talk with scientists that are near you and learn from them. Be humble and learn and listen. I think that's the best resource that anybody has. One of Barta's statistics for youth leaders was striking. 52% of youth will go into a science or technology related field, but only 1% of youth groups in his surveys talked about science and faith one time a year. So in other words, this area where these youth group kids will be involved in science, or will be involved in their vocation, they're not being resourced by the church. So I would love to see pastors and church leaders edge into that, like move into it. Don't think that you're going to have to be Francis Collins. That's fine. You don't have to be, but begin to ask the questions, begin to find the resources around you, and talk about these things and demonstrate how powerful the gospel is and how good it is to know the God who is both our Redeemer and our Creator.
To just add, to dot the I and cross the T that was just made by the good doctor, I would say maybe the most meaningful thing about Francis Collins, we're lucky to have him. His book, The Language of God, is acting as Mere Christianity once did, and still is working. But I would say, as you said, to act out the gospel, Doctor. We see that in the example of the way Francis Collins interacted with Christopher Hitchens. Christopher Hitchens, when they first met, kind of mocked his question. And then he got ill and they developed a relationship. And it's just a beautiful story. And if there's nothing else you know about Francis Collins, maybe look into that, because he doesn't just write about his faith. He lived it out there in that relationship with Hitchens. And Hitchens recognized that this man was different. He's different than all the Christians who write me telling me how I'm going to spend my eternity. This guy actually lives up to it. And so I would say we're lucky to have him in a position where he's recognized, and we were lucky to have you on our show, Doctor. I can't recommend your book high enough, as I know that is sometimes a slight to people, but I actually mean it. Mere Science and the Christian Faith. Love to have you on again to talk more, Lewis. But
love to talk, Lewis.
It's been great meeting you. And can you tell us, just before we let you go, what your relationship is to that? You have drums and guitar behind you. Are you kind of like Prince? Do you play everything, or what's going on back there?
Well, the drums are something the drums are something I've done for a long, long time, like, I don't know, 40 some years. The guitar, it's a bass is a little more aspirational. I'm learning the bass. So I figure if I put it up behind me.
It's a 5-string bass. 5-string bass?
Yes, it is. That's right. Okay. Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah, I'm a jazz and kind of gospel R&B drummer. So the 5-string is really nice for that, So yes, that's where that comes from. But as I said, the bass is more aspirational now.
Well, you're a rhythm guy. If you can do the drums, you'd be very proficient on the bass, because drums, I mean, keep us in time.
And bass players have been in my ear forever, literally, right? Yeah. They're right, like behind me on the left. So yeah, exactly. Yeah. Well, I mean, I just want to resonate just for a minute with what you said, John. I know we're running to our end here, but I have been able to meet with Francis Collins a couple times over meals, kind of serendipitously. And I have had that exact experience that you're talking about as I said, he's one of my modern heroes. I'm not given over to having many heroes, but he really is one of my few heroes. And I think in addition to the relationship with Christopher Hitchens, the brilliant arch atheist who died of esophageal cancer, as many people know, and it was written up, by the way, in a great article by another Christian leader, Pete Wehner. That's amazing. But also the thing about Francis Collins is he's so humble. He wanted to talk about me. And he wanted to talk about C.S. Lewis. Honestly, I said I think we have a mutual interest, C.S. Lewis, and he said, "Well, that's worth talking about." And I think he embodies humility, and he embodies so much. So I admire him. I admire the way that he's been an example, both in his intellectual work, but also in his interpersonal life. So I think he's a great person to point to.
Well, and if he and N.T. Wright ever need some backup, I mean, now you play bass or drums. I mean, you could go on the road.
There we go.
Yeah. Well, again, it was a pleasure to have you, Kristine.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much for joining us.